Hello everybody. In this video we're going to get economical, and I wanted to touch on a couple of topics because I've been seeing and thinking about this idea how basically wealth or prosperity is generated or is created, and it basically comes down to the idea of money moving around, what I call, or I think what is known as money flow. And this idea of money flow basically leads to prosperity and wealth. Now, I've been reading this book that talks about how if you don't basically move money around, right, and are able to actually register property so that people that you don't know can get in on the action, can buy in on the action, then it's very difficult for you to actually generate wealth. And this happens with marginal or subcapital economies, like think favelas in Brazil, where local markets are in place, but everything just stays in the local area. It doesn't move beyond what is known or what is familiar because of the trust factor, because people don't trust other people, or people at least that they don't know, right? So this amazes me because the mere fact that wealth is generated simply by the fact of moving money around is something that I was like, it's that simple. But I guess it makes sense because when you move money around, and think about this, when you move money around, you move people around, right? You get people to do things. So it gets people moving and it also gets things done, right? Now think of like, now in this case, we would be talking more in terms of like a city or like a major capital city, but think more in terms of like a ranch or a small town where there isn't a lot of wealth or growth, right? But first, before we get into that, let's define a couple of these topics. What is wealth and how do you measure growth, for example? Because I believe these are like very abstract ideas or concepts, such as the economy, right? When people say the economy is doing good or the economy is doing bad, it's like, what does that even mean? You know, what do you mean economy? So one way in which economy is measured is with GDP. And GDP basically is the goods and services that are produced in a city, in a state, in a country. I believe it's in a country. So everything that's produced within a specific period of time, right? That's the GDP. So it's like how much business that country or that city has. And I guess this makes more sense now in nationalistic terms. Like you could think about, oh, the Chinese versus the French, right? But not so much in terms of, you know, only exclusively nationalistic, but rather economic, right? In terms of economy, I think people will get like very nationalistic, right? Like this is my group and my group is not going to be taken advantage of, right? Okay, so there are other measurements like the average household income, which I found to be very interesting because I asked ChatGPT, like, what's the average household income for the United States, right? Like just average, because ChatGPT gets all like, well, it depends on, and it's like, don't get smart with me. Just tell me what the average is, right? Or whatever. The average household income for different countries, right? And you start to compare among different countries and as well as the potential for saving. Now, I found this to be very important. Two things that we're going to get into in a little bit. Well, one of them right now, which is the potential for saving, and the other one is the potential to pay back the interest that you owe, or at least pay back the money that you owe, right? Actually, at least pay back the interest of what you owe. And we're going to see this in a moment with like countries, right? Employment rates, you know, if jobs are being created, if people, you know, what are the statistics of unemployment, of employment, how many people are being hired. And I guess you can get those statistics with like, I don't know, taxes, right? Depending on how many people are paying taxes is going to depend on how many people are, for example, are employed. Property values, right? So how much a house is worth, how much that land is worth, and just in general business activity. So the line between like, excuse me, government and societal organization and business is so thin, and a lot of times it does cross over, right? So it's like, how important is it for the government to basically run like a business nowadays when when we live in like an economy driven and capitalistic, highly capitalistic societies where it's all about money, right? So then I also thought about this because I was like, what about the state distribution? Not state as in country, but like, what about actual states within a country? You know, like how do they get their money, right? Do they get their money like just from father federal government? Like, hey, federal government, give us states our money, right? Our budget. And yes and no. And this is something that I found out. The state needs to generate their own revenue, right? So it's like the state wants to, I don't know, um, like invest in a business or something. Like I guess anything that's like very locally, we can say, or internally. Um, Basically, the state needs to make for itself, and furthermore, they need to give that to the federal government. So I was like, what? I thought that the state just received, money from the federal government, but no, it's actually the state gives the federal, and it makes sense because think about taxes. Think about like the federal government, the country, how they pay for things like the military and things like that with taxes. But how do they get those taxes if they're in the capital, right? Like Washington D.C., Mexico City. Well, they get them through the states, and the states get them through taxes, right? So they tax people, fees, licenses. Like if you want a license, to drive a car, you got to pay, right? An annual whatever verification, fines, bonds, investments. So the state gives this money to the federal government, but the federal government also gives the state money in terms, at least in the United States, of what is called grants. Now, grants are for roads, education, health, all of those popular political presidential debate topics. That's what that federal money given to the states is for, right? So if we look at it like if we take a step back and look at it, money's flowing back and forth, right? And there's no clear way, I would say, of seeing who gives who more. Does the state or do the states give the federal government more than the federal government gives the states, right? Because money is just flowing back and forth all the time. Again, the flow of money produces wealth. Maybe, I don't know. That's the question we're trying to answer here. Now, marginal economies, subcapital economies, economies that operate outside of the law, not necessarily criminal, but that just evade taxes. For example, you'll open up your business, or you'll sell like clothes, but only to people that really know you. They'll pay you for the clothes that you get from somewhere else, but you're not paying taxes. Your business is not registered, right, to the government. Like people will operate this. A lot of poor countries actually operate like this, and this book talks about how a lot of poor countries aren't actually poor. They just have those marginal economies, which aren't part of the central government, we could say, and they're generating wealth, but the government's not getting a piece of that. They're not taxing that, right? Basically, they're not getting any money for that. Which you could say, well, yeah, fuck the government, but at the same time, it's kind of like, well, that's affecting the country. But then you could say, well, what about the corrupt politicians that will just take that money for themselves? Well, that's the problem. Corruption is a major problem. We all know that. So marginal economies and wealth is abundant among these communities. And I had a question like, but okay, if there's so much wealth there, why are they distributing that like communistic, socialist style? And basically, yes, there. But the thing here is that they don't produce major wealth because, again, we go back to the first problem. They only operate locally. So they're not going to ramify or branch out into other cities, into other areas, go national or international. They just stay local. So the money moves around, but only in that area, right? And again, that's going to limit your wealth, because if you're able to branch out and have the money flow like majorly, I think that's what's ultimately going to make you wealthier and prosper, and more prosperous, right? So yeah, they do this because of the factor of trust, right? Of dealing with unknown people, not trusting the people in your own country that are outside of your community, outside of the people that you're familiar with. Lack of trust of the unknown and unfamiliar people, right? Okay, so now I'm gonna get into countries a little bit. So if this theory is true, this would mean that rich countries, the richest countries in the world, would have to have major flow and major spending, right, of money. And the answer is yes. They consume more goods as well, right? They spend, for example, in military, in social services, in infrastructure, and research and development. For example, the United States, we know, has one of the best military in the world, and they accounted for 39% of the world's military spending in 2020, right? And what's more interesting about their whole budget system is that they have like three major categories. The first one is like everything that they have to spend on, like social programs, health. They have another one which is like for the military, for defense, and then they have one which is a category to pay interest on debt. Right now, I'm gonna get into some facts right here. I asked ChatGPT which are the most in debt countries or indebted countries in the world at the moment, and get ready for this. The first one is Japan, second one is Sudan, and the third one is Greece. The United States is in the list, coming in at 10th, in 10th place. Italy is also on the list, coming in at in fifth place, right? And then I said, okay, so is there a correlation between being in debt and having high GDP? That means being wealthy, right? So the more you spend, the more you borrow, the more you have, basically. The more you consume, the more you earn, right? Money is flowing. And the countries with the highest GDP are the USA, China, and Japan, right? So again, we see Japan in both lists, right? The US is also on both lists. China currently is not, I think, on the list of indebted countries or countries that are in debt, but Italy is. Italy is in fifth place for the most in debt country at the moment, but it's also in ninth place for the country with the ninth highest GDP, right? And here we also have to take into consideration consumer habits, right? Like I think the United States is one of the countries, one of the countries that most consumes services and goods in the world, right? And they're also one of the wealthiest, right? So that's kind of like, food for thought. Like, how does that work, right? And last but not least, I want to talk about supply and demand. So the notion of supply and demand is very interesting for many reasons, but one of them is basically when you supply, that means that you're producing, that means you're selling, right? And when you demand, that means you're consuming or you're purchasing, right? So my question was like, what's this correlation between the United States and China that people talk about so much lately? And they say China's going to become the new superpower and China's going to become the new USA. And it's like, I don't know, because China, they say, is the world's factory. That's where everything is made. And you can say that China is actually the one who sells, and then the United States is the one that buys, right? Not necessarily in that like China sells to the US and the US buys from China, no, but just in general, China sells to the world, and the US buys from the world, right? Major supply and major demand, right? Okay, and the US is one of the largest consumers of goods and services globally. So I was curious, which are the countries that most supply the world with things, right? The supplying countries. In this case, we have Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Mexico, which basically they sell to the world, right? And then you have the European Union and Japan, as well as India and Canada, where they buy, right? And look who's on this list of demand. Japan. Japan is in both lists, right? So Japan is one of the countries that most produces in the world, but it's also one of the countries that most buys, right? And it was interesting to find like the top superpowers on these lists because, well, yeah, it talks about risk. Obviously, you're not gonna, be safe. You're probably gonna lose money when you risk it, when you try to sell, when you try to buy, right? When you try to flip things. But that idea of like the flow of money is ultimately what generates wealth. Why is that, right? Like, why does, and my idea, my basic notion of that would be like, well, you're moving things around, and because I asked ChatGPT once, like, what would happen if everybody, and that would be like a protest that I would one day do against like someone or like a power I didn't like, which I think would be effective nowadays, would be to like not buy anything, right? Like get people to not buy anything, and that way like the government or whoever suffers, right? That would be kind of mean, but that would just be like the idea, because ultimately what gives people wealth is that flow of money, and we talk about surplus, or getting more for the thing, right? Like if you have a house, and I think that's dependent on creativity and ideas, right? Innovating and ultimately detecting needs, right? Like very business entrepreneurial oriented, detecting needs where other people haven't detected those needs, right? And you're able to detect those needs. I think that's key, right? Because if you're like, okay, I have this land, right? And this land is worth, I don't know, whatever, 200,000, let's just say, for example. I'm unaware of the type of money land right now costs, but let's say it's 200,000, and then you sell it for 200,000, and that someone that you sold it to has a better idea, has a good idea for what to do with it, so they flip it and they compound that land right into like millions of dollars because they open a brand new restaurant that's like super famous, that everybody's going there, tourists are flocking there, or just any type of new notions and ideas, right? That's kind of like the thing that ultimately gives things a surplus. It's kind of like when you use like your house to take out a credit or to take out a loan, right? So you say, okay, I'm gonna put up my house, or I'm gonna put up my car so I can get a loan, right? And you're using, I mean, you're still using your car, you're still using your house, but it has like a double value, right? And that's kind of what it is. It's like looking at something, and instead of just being very practical and like this is just worth this, right? Like seeing the potential in it, and getting more out of it, right? Kind of like exploiting things. That's a very capitalistic mentality, right? Like, okay, I see potential here, like let's exploit this, right? Of course, that in excess is bad, especially when done to humans, but that's another topic, all right? So let me know what you think about all this. I thought it's pretty interesting that the flow of money can bring you wealth. And yeah, that's all I got for this video. So I'll see you in the next one. All right. Peace.